Chapter 4 Reddy Grows Up. The next day found Reddy so stiff and sore from his wounds that he could scarcely move from his bed in the spruce thicket. There was a long rip down his flank which troubled him the most, but this he could lick and keep from being infected. Other cuts on his shoulders and neck he was unable to reach, and these might have become serious if the wolf had not licked them thoroughly for him and had taken out all the dirt and poison. Most of the day was spent in nursing the wounds in this way, the treatment being so good that by evening Reddy joined the king in his usual hunting, although not with any vim. Their first care was to make sure that the men they'd tracked on the day before had not come any closer to the spruce thicket. A circle around the valley crossed no fresh man tracks, but the wolf knew that man always came back to his tracks, and that the danger was still serious. His manner conveyed to Reddy the general feeling of danger. For all the months of his association with the wolf, it had made the hound a wild creature too, in everything except his looks. He even acted enough like a timber wolf to go unchallenged by the packs they had so far encountered. Very few men besides Johnny had ever caught glimpses of the lanky red pup that followed the black wolf wherever he traveled, and none as yet suspected that he was not just an odd-colored member of a wolf pack. Johnny, almost always in the mountains and very much on the lookout for the pup, saw him a number of times. He marveled at his growth and felt almost exultant at the realization that he was a magnificent animal. Once, while watching him through binoculars, he saw the wolf and the pup play together like brothers on the short grass of a little pocket among the rocks. The wolf was noticeably gentle on account of his far greater strength, but in the rough and tumbling rolling, the chasing and the mock fighting, the speed and the cleverness of the pup were equally apparent. Some of the time the pup would be the aggressor and try to maul the great black creature that led him on, but always somehow thwarted his attempts to get a good hold. For an animal that must live by fighting, it was exactly the right kind of practice. Johnny, trying to come closer with his usual cat-like tread, found that though this might be fairly easy in the case of other mountain creatures, with the black wolf on guard it was impossible. Up sprang the king and fairly melted away among the rocks, with the pup like a shadow behind him. During the summer the pup often saw an old gray she-wolf leading her 4 lanky cubs around the mountains, occasionally accompanied by the father, a yellow-grayish animal of considerable size. Although no match for the king, whose presence he always seemed ill at ease in. Each time they met, the king would walk forward stiff-legged, head up until he and the other male could almost touch noses. There he would stand, looking down at the other from his greater height, until the gray backed away, thus acknowledging the king's supremacy. Although the wolves were very conscious of Reddy, they gave him no special notice after the formalities between the 2 leaders, which settled everything. Had the leaders fought, then Reddy would have been attacked by the 4 cubs who were almost exactly his age, and if that had happened, he would have had small chance to survive. Always it was the strength and wisdom of the king that brought him through the dangers of wilderness life. Though he sensed these things dimly and took much for granted, it was a small wonder that his almost blind adulation of the great wolf never wavered, and that the odd friendship between these 2 grew closer every day. There was only one thing on which their ideas did not quite meet, and that was the status of man in relation to them. The king had every reason to fear man, while the hound feared him only because of the training given by the wolf. Reddy, indeed, never missed the chance to watch man, almost as if he was fascinated. Sometimes he spent hours looking across the valley at Johnny cutting wood and doing the chores around his cabin, with the 3 well-grown hound pups playing about him. There was a wistfulness in Reddy's manner at such times. He would have liked to go closer and perhaps join in on the play. When the gunners had come into the mountains for the autumn hunting, Reddy had tried to keep track of them and their doings. He'd studied their footprints, much as the wolf had. He'd often seen them stalking game and fishing in the creeks. When there was no snow, he could usually do this without being noticed, but sometimes the high-powered glasses of the guides would pick him out, and the men would speculate as how it happened that a big red hound was ranging in the wilds apparently alone. Johnny, more closely in touch with the wild animals than the ordinary hunter, knew that the almost impossible had happened, and that Reddy had been adopted by the great King Wolf. To him, this became the most important interest in his life in the wilds. He wanted to see how it would develop and how it would end. Often he and Mac discussed it, but he would speak of it to no one else for fear of bringing some kind of trouble into the hound's life. A wolf was bad enough in game country, Mac said one day, but beware of a hound. Mac insisted that the hound would be just like a wolf, and eventually be killed as one, but Johnny reasoned differently. He could not quite work it out in his mind, but he felt sure that there would always be a difference which might lead to strange things. Meanwhile, he was raising Reddy's brother and 2 sisters, the Black and Tans, to be strong youngsters who could soon be taught to seriously hunt and trail. Already they were chasing gophers and snowshoe hares and other small creatures around the cabin, though Johnny took care that they did not wander too far. After the hunting season closed, trappers came into the mountains. 2 men shared the trapping rights in the Little Sheep Creek Valley, and while they brought with them a small tent, they spent much of their time at Johnny's comfortable cabin. Their catches of ermine and marten and wolverine, lynx and coyote pelts were stacked where the Black and Tans could not reach them. They tended a trap line that made half circle through several miles in length. In the evenings they discussed trapping and all the things of interest that they'd noted during the day, including the tracks of big game animals such as moose and mountain sheep and deer. One of the men was particularly interested in timber wolves and carried a rifle in order to shoot any that he saw. There was a bounty on big wolves and much value in their pelts. "Some day I'm going to give this trapping of small stuff up and make some money with snares," he told Johnny. "There are 2 of the biggest kind of wolves running together on the other side of the valley, and a pack of ordinary ones that ought to be easy meat. We see their tracks everywhere, but they won't go near the steel traps." Johnny, taken in surprise, said nothing, but he worried about this. More snow came to the mountain, and in some places it was several feet deep. In others, where the wind blew it away, the rocks were bare. Fortunately for the wolves, the sun melted the top layer, and exposed areas formed a fairly strong crust. Hard running, however, was not necessary for the wolves, because the food animals found the going especially difficult, and spent almost all of their time in small sheltered areas, where they soon packed down the snow into regular roadways and yards. The moose and the deer were in the timber, and the sheep and the goats in the narrow canyons where the snow could not cling to the steep sides. Another pack of wolves had come into the valley and joined the family of 6. It was easier for a large number to pull down a big animal, like a moose, which could put up a terrific fight with its hooves. Therefore the wolves stuck together, though there was not any good feeling between the different groups. They could be heard howling almost every night. The king was worried. While he could whip and fight almost any wolf in this big pack, he'd seen on many occasions the danger that faced the hound when several wolves threatened to attack. His instinct to protect the young came forward strongly, and one night when the big pack was going full cry down the valley, he struck out across the ridge with Reddy to seek some place far from this menace. They chose the easiest way and followed the paths of the sheep and goats wherever possible. When they topped the ridge, the king felt much less uneasy. Ahead were dozens of valleys, all of which he knew from one end to the other. He stood there a few moments looking back and listening, the hound beside him. Below them the wolf chorus had died down. Complete silence reigned over the cold mountains. An ominous silence, different somehow from the usual stillness of night. Suddenly the wolf saw a thin line of dark dots against the snow. It wound slowly around the cliffs far below. and might not have held his attention if he had not known that it was following the exact trail that he had just left. He moved forward to see more clearly, and with him moved Reddy. There was no doubt now. The dots were wolves, and they were following the king's tracks. With what intent was not yet clear. The king looked round at the treeless ridge, which offered no protection. His instinct led him to run down the other side of the ridge to reach the tree country, or at least the boulders. He and the hound fairly wallowed in the deep snow for a while, but at length came to a spruce thicket, and then to big timber. The wolf led to a cluster of rocks surrounded by tall spruce trees. There he sat down to wait. Every few minutes he got up and wandered around restlessly, only to return to the rocks. Reddy had sensed immediately that danger was close at hand. He too had seen the wolves coming along their trail. He watched and listened as intently as the king. They had not very long to wait. Presently the woods seemed to be full of moving forms, and the acrid smell of many wolves. The pack, failing to find meat that night, had taken the hound's trail in a half-hearted way, experimentally, hoping that something might come of it, but not exactly sure what to do. They knew the king. There was that one opening through which they could reach the rocks, and in front of this stood the black wolf, always between them and the hound. The males came one by one to go through the usual greeting formalities with the king, but they dared go no further. Members of the pack slunk about, or sat in the snow watching expectantly and whining occasionally. They were a gaunt, shaggy lot, with lolling tongues and shifty, slanting eyes. All were restless and uneasy about starting a fight. Now and then they would raise their sharp noses to better catch the dog scent which lured them. But with it always was the scent of the big black wolf. Yet in every crowd there's at least one, and in the present case this one was the yellowish-gray male, who had long hated the king. He stayed persistently near the opening, trying to get up the nerve enough to pass through regardless, and to fight if need be. Always a ruthless killer, he was hungry now. Around him gradually gathered several others, as if knowing that at the proper time he would lead. The tenseness increased. Reddy, now knowing that it was his life at stake, nevertheless was thoroughly aroused and bristling along his whole spine. Quarrels started among the younger members of the pack, who snarled and snapped at each other at the least provocation. Presently, the yellowish-gray could stand it no longer. He came forward, straight to the black wolf, with others crowding behind him and giving encouragement. There was a fateful moment when a deep growl rumbled from the throat of the king, and then a whirlwind attack. Wolves and snow literally filled the air. The king had crushed the gray's left front leg with his first fierce bite, and slashed his shoulder with the next. They rose on their hind legs and clawed at each other, biting and snarling and whirling about. The gray suddenly went over headlong among his backers, and the king dashed into the whole group, slashing this way and that with lightning speed. One slipped past in the melee and sprang for the hound, who closed with him in a battle to the death. Reddy had fighting blood in his veins, as well as the training of the great wolf, and when his ear was slashed and his leg laid open, he merely bored all that harder, until he had the wolf down and by the throat. Grimly, with scarcely a sound except labored breathing, they fought in the snow, while the bigger battle raged furiously around them. It all died down as quickly as it had started. The pack wolves saw that this was no picnic, and they slunk away, all except one, the gray leader who could only limp on 3 legs. Everywhere the snow was spattered with blood, and blood followed the pack in its retreat over the ridge. Reddy crouched beside the dead wolf and looked at him. The furrows in his big eyes deeper than ever, and a strange feeling of power soothed his troubled heart. He had fought and won a battle. What mattered if he was bitten and clawed from nose to tail? He could hold his own against an enemy. And never again would he be a simple-minded, aimless pup, satisfied to be led and babied. End of chapter 4.